Hi, my name is Ann Warda. I'm the founder of Kids at the Core, providing resources and tools for educators to help all kids grow. Today we're going to be talking about Type 3 assessments and how we can use those to measure growth. So growth is really looking at the measurable change between 2 points in time. We can't talk about growth with one single data point. Growth needs multiple data points. Whereas attainment is a little bit different. Attainment is something where you measure with one data point. So this might be the percentage of students who are proficient on a final exam, or the percentage of students who scored on grade level in a reading assessment. This is really looking at how much information the student knows or what their ability level is at that single point in time. It's not comparing anything that they're doing to a previous point in time. So for example, to go back to that reading assessment, there may be several students who are reading on grade level at the date of the assessment. Some of those students may have made great progress since the last time they were assessed. Other ones of them could have flatlined. And if you only looked at that one single attainment data point, you wouldn't have that extra dimension to look at how much students are improving and growing over time. So for example, when we look at attainment, we might say something like, the students are going to get 15 out of 20 points by the end of the school year, meaning 15 maybe is some sort of a proficiency cut point. Now we're looking at simply getting the students to a particular score. Growth, on the other hand, is looking at change. So for example, we'll look at 80% of the students are going to get 5 points more. So now we're looking at where they started and how much better they are as a result of the work they've done in those classrooms. So in order to measure growth, we're going to need some sort of a quantifying tool. So some tool that we can use to measure that change over time. The great thing about the growth assessments is it's going to help us keep the focus on all learners. So some students may be closer to proficiency than others from the get-go, but the goal here is that no matter where the student starts, they're making appropriate growth. So how are we going to do this? We got to get some assessments together. We like to call these the mirrored assessment sets. Now, these are comparable, not identical, but comparable assessments that are designed to measure learning at 2 or more points in time. In order for these assessments to be comparable, they need to have the same format, the same content, and same complexity. So to focus in on these 3 pieces, by format we mean that we're talking about multiple choice tests compared to multiple choice, or a performance compared to a performance. In content, we're really looking at the skills that are being measured, and of course complexity level, we're looking at the difficulty with which we're using to ask those questions. One of the really important things to keep in mind is that every assessment should be tied to what we call a pivot point. A pivot point is a place in the teacher's lesson where they stop, look at the data, and decide what the best next move would be. Much like on the basketball court, a player would plant a foot and decide which direction they want to pivot based on what the court looks like at that moment. So they're getting some sort of feedback from that scenario as they assess the scene. Now, in a classroom, a teacher would assess the students, get some feedback on the student learning, plant their foot, and pivot. Change what they plan to do based on the needs of the unique students in that classroom. Pivot points are the great place where teachers have the opportunity to differentiate and make sure that all students are growing, all students are reaching their goals. The problem that we often have with our pivot points is we need the right kinds of assessments in place to make that pivot. In other words, if we don't have good formative assessments that give us information about what's working and what's not working and how students are growing or not growing, then we're not going to have the ability to make those pivots. So let's really differentiate between our formatives and summatives. Going back to assessment 101. Formatives, these are assessments for learning. They occur during the learning process. They're assessments that would allow us to make modifications on teaching based on what information we're learning from students, and of course allow us to give feedback to the student on their learning. Now the summative assessment, that's like the autopsy assessment. It's at the end when the kids are heading out for summer break or moving on to the next course. This is the end of the opportunity we have to improve learning. So honestly, we can give a chapter test, which we might traditionally consider summative, but if we use that information to reteach, we can use it in a formative way. The idea is the only assessment that is truly summative would be the last assessment that a student takes before they leave that particular class or course. So let's look for elements of excellence. What are we looking for in our individual classroom assessments? Remember that we're in the age of assessment. There are tools available to us, whether it's through our curriculum, through our district, through teacher pay teacher, through online resources, there's assessments that we could be continually giving our students. So we need to make sure that the data we get from these assessments is of value to us, because every time we give an assessment, we give up instructional time. So we want to make sure that the instructional time that we've given to that assessment tool is going to be valuable to us. In other words, provide us information on how we can help the students to better learn in this particular area. So again, we're going back to those pivot points. That data should help you to be a better teacher. Let's look at a simple assessment implementation model, with assessment A being a baseline assessment, some sort of assessment that's going to be given at the beginning of instruction so that we can kind of find out how kids are starting off. And of course, there's typical ability levels, but some students will be above or some students will be low, and this is where we find out where kids typically are on that spectrum. We would analyze that data and pivot. Change what we plan to do based on the unique needs of the unique group of students in this classroom. Continue to teach, obviously continue to administer additional formatives, and then you would give assessment B. Assessment B would be a mirror of assessment A in the same content, the same complexity, the same format. Again, analyze that data, pivot, continue to teach, and assessment C would then be able to tell us how much students grew between the two measurement points of A and C. So what we're doing is we're assessing threads that are running through more than one unit. So it's not just one specific unit, but rather the growth that we see over multiple units. For our formatives, that means assessment A functions as a formative because we would use it to pivot. Assessment B functions as a formative, and each of these minor formatives that we may give informally throughout the instructional interval, those would also be functioning as formative assessments. Now, in a growth model, this same best practice of teaching would find the assessment A as our baseline. That's the one we would use to write a growth goal. Assessment B would be that midpoint check-in on the learning. And then, of course, assessment C would be our final post-test, where we would talk about how much students have grown as a result of the instruction they received during that cycle. Now, obviously, 3 is not a magic number. 3 assessments fits nice into a graphic, but of course, you're going to want to have some formative information between your pre and your post. If you have any questions, please feel free to let us know or check out our website, kidsatthecore.com.